Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Melissa Siegel. I'm a professor of migration studies, and this is a channel about all things migration. So today we're going to talk about remittances, and specifically we're going to be talking about the impact of COVID-19 on remittances in 2020. Now, in a previous video last year, I did talk about the predictions of what would happen with regard to COVID-19 and how that would affect remittances, and that was, of course, based on estimates from the World Bank. Well, now the World Bank has come out with a new Migration and Development Brief, so the Migration and Development Brief 34, which is actually taking a look back at 2020 and seeing what actually happened. And so the title of that brief is Resilience COVID-19 Crisis Through a Migration Lens. So I'm going to be giving you a quick peek at what the World Bank actually found last year with regard to remittances, and I can already tell you, quick spoiler alert, it is not as bad as we feared, which is great to hear, but of course there's still a lot we need to keep an eye on and more work that needs to be done also from a policy perspective to hopefully make sure that we can try to continue to mitigate the negative effects of COVID-19 on migrants and specifically on remittances. So let's see what happened last year in 2020. Well, it was predicted that remittances would decrease by about 20% in 2020, and luckily that didn't happen. Remittances actually only decreased by 1.6% compared to 2019, which is really, really great to hear. So specifically, officially recorded remittance flows to low and middle income countries reached $540 billion US, which was only slightly below the $548 billion that was sent in 2019. If we even exclude China from the mix, remittances surpassed the sum of foreign direct investment and official development assistance in 2020. And we've seen how important remittances are for, well, they're extremely resilient, and especially compared to foreign direct investment and official development aid, we are seeing them becoming even more and more important. Before this reason, of course, we've seen that particularly through this crisis, remittances have been very, very important for consumption smoothing, for poverty alleviation and reducing the severity of poverty in many countries around the world for those families, for those households that are receiving their remittances. And we see how important they really are as a kind of informal social protection strategy for many households. What we can also see here is that while remittances did take a quite strong hit in the second quarter of 2020, we already started to see recovery in different parts of the world already in the third and the fourth quarters of 2020. Here you can actually see the top remittance recipients among low and middle income countries according to what the World Bank found in their report, and you can see it both in absolute terms and in relative terms as a percentage of GDP. So in absolute terms, we see again that India is the top recipient, followed by China, Mexico, the Philippines, Egypt, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Vietnam, and Ukraine. India has actually had a very strong and solid continuation with being in the top spot of remittance receivers. So they've actually been in the top spot, been the top remittance receiver since 2008. Now, if we look at the countries who are the top receivers as a percentage of their GDP, we see something a bit different. So in general, it is smaller countries here that we see that are really being very highly affected by remittances. So we see Tonga, Lebanon, the Kyrgyz Republic, Tajikistan, El Salvador, Honduras, Nepal, Haiti, Jamaica, and Lesotho here. All of these countries have more than 20% of their GDP being made up of remittances. So we see that remittances are really, really important actually for these countries, even more important in many ways than for the countries that have the highest amounts in absolute terms. So we've seen now the top countries for remittance sending. What were the top countries for remittance receiving? Well, as usual, the United States was the largest source country for remittances in 2020, followed by the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and the Russian Federation, who are generally all usually in those top spots also for remittance sending countries. Now, there are a number of reasons behind the resilience that we are seeing in the remittance sending. So the first and foremost reason is the reason that people are migrating and sending remittances in the first place. It's all about a desire to help their families and to make sure that their families have a roof over their head and food in their bellies. And so what we actually saw during this crisis is that even when migrants themselves perhaps lost their jobs or didn't have the same level of income, they reduced their own well-being to make sure that they could keep sending those remittances back because they knew how important they are for the families, for the households, the individuals, and the countries where they're sending those remittances. So already the reason that people are sending remittances in the first place is also one of the main reasons that we see that strong growth or that strong resilience of remittances during the COVID crisis. Of course, there are also other reasons for this resilience that we're seeing with regard to remittances. Other things include, the fiscal stimulus packages that many of the host countries of migrants distributed to their populations, and also very many times migrants were included in these stimulus packages. There was also some better than expected economic performance in some of the main countries where migrants were being hosted. We also saw, very importantly, a shift in remittances being sent from informal channels to formal channels. So informal channels for remittances are things like hand carrying the money yourself or sending it with family or friends. And since mobility was not as possible, we saw people shifting to other channels. So sending money, for instance, through money transfer operators or banks. We also did see a shift from people sending more cash-based to also using more digital payment systems. So we saw both this shift from informal to formal and a shift from more cash-based to more digital-based, which was, forced upon many migrants as a necessity because of the situation. There were also differences with regard to currency exchange rates and oil prices that also affected remittances at the time. Particularly the cash transfers and employment support that we saw many host countries of migrants have and implemented in many large economies helped to really cushion the fall in personal incomes and consumption. It also helped to support businesses in the continuing employment of workers. And many times these programs didn't only benefit the local workers, but also the migrant workers in those areas. Again, the not as bad performance as we had expected in North America and Europe also helped to cushion what we actually thought was going to be the case. And of course, North America and Europe did see a hit, but it was not as big as was projected often early on in the crisis. So we already got to see that there was a shift from sending remittances informally to sending remittances formally. And that means that perhaps a lot of remittances that we were not able to capture in statistics previously were now able to be captured. It does not necessarily mean that we actually saw an increase in remittances or that the picture would have been so incredibly different otherwise. It might just be also now that we're seeing a lot of things that we possibly didn't see before. It's very hard to know exactly how many informal remittances there currently still are in 2020 since it's very hard to measure these things. Now, there were also quite some regional differences with regard to remittance sending in 2020. Some regions fared better and some regions fared worse. So there were specific regions that saw increases in remittances in 2020. That was, for instance, in Latin America and the Caribbean, which saw growth of 6.5% during the period. This really had to do with the recovery of the economy and the kind of moderately improved labor market in the United States. In South Asia, we also saw a slight moderation in growth of remittances in 2020 to 5.2%. And in the Middle East and North Africa, we also saw modest growth in remittances by 2.3%. Now, of course, there were parts of the world that were not as lucky and saw a decrease in remittances. So remittance flows to Europe and Central Asia were estimated to have fallen by almost 10%. In East Asia and the Pacific, remittances were estimated to have fallen by around 8%. And Sub-Saharan Africa seems to have been hit the worst, with an estimated decrease in remittances of 12.5%. So you can see that regionally, there really were some significant differences in how different regions were able to weather the COVID-19 storm. So another issue was the weak oil prices that we saw connected with the COVID-19. So remittances from oil-dependent economies declined more than in non-oil dependent economies. So for example, the weak oil prices affected the employments of migrant workers in the GCC countries or the Gulf cooperation countries, which led, of course, to a reduction in outward remittances from these countries in the region, in the GCC region. In the case of Russia, also another major oil producer, the effects both of weak oil prices and of depreciation of the currency caused a nearly 10% fall in remittance flows to Europe and Central Asia, which are major recipients of remittances from Russia. If we look at remittance flows to Bangladesh and Pakistan, they were also affected by additional factors such as the cancellation of the pilgrimages to Mecca or the Hajj, also floods in Bangladesh in July of 2020, and tax incentives offered to attract remittances. In the case of Mexico, there was also a sharp depreciation of the peso against the US dollar, which happened since March of 2020, and this then attracted even more remittances since goods and services and assets in Mexico became cheaper to purchase with the US dollar. Now, what does this mean for the future? Well, as you can see from predictions from last year to what we see actually happening in 2020, predictions are difficult to make because there are a lot of variables included. So looking ahead, we see that the World Bank does predict that remittance flows to low and middle income countries are expected to increase by 2.6% in 2021 and by 2.2% in 2022. So remittances are expected to go twice as fast in Latin America and the Caribbean and South Asia, but are expected to decline further in Europe and Central Asia and remain slow also in Sub-Saharan Africa. Again, these projections are very difficult to make since we don't really know how long the COVID crisis is going to go on. We don't know about new variants, and a lot of the stimulus packages that governments were able to implement in the past year might not be sustainable also into the future. So we'll see what happens next. Do stay tuned to this channel to see what happens next because we'll make sure to cover it here. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to this channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of my videos that I upload every week. And I do hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.